and welcome to IILM University's Samvaad Series. I'm Ankita Mukherjee. They say there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. In the last 6 weeks or so, that particular adage has probably never been more true. We are at a fragile, uncertain moment in global geopolitics where everything is uncertain, where constraints abound. There are economies which have looked unshakable, which have felt a huge energy shock. Capital is no longer safe, and sustainability is probably the biggest imperative of all. In these uncertain moments, how do we navigate? Does the future demand leaders, policies, which will have the ability to do far more with far less? And to navigate this particular moment, we have with us Professor Jaideep, Prabhu, and Dr. Priyank, Narayan, who've written Lean Spark, Frugal by Design, Global in Impact, which we hope will give us the tools to navigate precisely this very uncertain, uncharted landscape that we see at the moment. Without further ado, Professor Prabhu, let me begin with you. Would you say that we are now at a moment where functioning under constraint is not just a possible advantage, but perhaps absolutely the definition of what we must look to going forward?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here at IILM and to be in such a wonderful setting. I think you've set the stage beautifully for this discussion because we are at a very critical moment in India and globally. And we live in a world of constraint and change. And in that context, I think our book is particularly relevant because it is about how we can use constraints as a spur for creativity and innovation, not as a roadblock, but as a spur. And as we argue in the book, India has over the years perfected this ability. We call it jugaad, we call it by other names, but essentially it's this idea that we have deeply ingrained in us that constraints are actually an opportunity to think differently, to act differently, and to innovate. So we think that our book is particularly relevant now for India and for the world. Hence the subtitle, Frugal by Design, Global in Impact.
So, Dr. Narayan, you would say that this is not just something that emerging economies or businesses or individuals or, for that matter, policymakers should be looking at within India or countries in the global south, but really there are ideas in this book that are scalable and applicable anywhere in the world.
Absolutely. Strategy has always been taught as assimilation of resources that are required. And we've always focused on saying, whether it's capital or it's other resources, we need to bring in resources, and unless we get in those resources, we're not going to get off the ground. What we're arguing in this book is do with what you have and do with much less, and let resource not be the roadblock in getting off the ground. And that's applicable universally if you look at it, right? So many countries, many institutions across the world are looking at models that have worked in India very differently. One of the examples we've talked about in the book is the story of Aadhaar and UPI as a country, how we've actually been able to give an identity to 1 billion people. But what it's actually led to is so many applications that ride on top of that platform.
I think that's a wonderful point that you make about digital public infrastructure, and maybe we can have that conversation a little later as we progress. But just to get a broader idea of the premise of the book and what you call the frugal innovation canvas. Professor Prabhu, would you say that frugality is a particularly Indian trait? I mean, if you look at where we are culturally in terms of our sensitivity, historically, Indians in a way embody frugality in a way that other countries perhaps do not. I'll give you one example from my own home state, which is Bengal, where every part of the banana tree is used up. The leaves are used as plates, raw bananas are used in curries, the stem is used, it's called thor, that's used in a particular way. The banana flower even is used as a vegetable. So there's literally nothing that is ever thrown away or anything that goes to waste. And would you say there are lessons in there for businesses, for policymakers? And, how do you, though, apply that sort of old-style sense of frugality to a world which is tech-heavy, which is perhaps capital-intensive? Is there a way of doing that?
Absolutely. So, this book, Lead Spark, builds on work that I've done with others over the last 15 years or so. And the initial work that we did was looking at the application of this mindset, this frugal, jugaad mindset, in a relatively low to mid-tech environment. We had looked in the book Jugaad Innovation, which came out in 2012, more than a decade ago, at this kind of innovation from the grassroots, from villages to cities, in startups, but also in large companies. And in that book, we had argued that this kind of jugaad innovation was something that, of course, we saw a lot of in India, but we also saw this in many other emerging markets. And after that book was published, we had people from other emerging markets that have similar sort of context to ours, write to tell us, hey, we have something like this in our country. The Brazilians told us they had two words to describe the same phenomenon. And it's interesting that you should mention the banana and the plant and what's done with that. Because just last year, I went to Brazil and spent 2 weeks there. They are world leaders like we are in frugal innovation. And we went to an enormous banana plantation where I realized they too use every part of the banana, including the stem, to make fiber and fabric and so on. So I think this is really a universal thing. But what we have seen since then is an evolution and a maturing of the environment in India in particular, when now this mindset is being applied to tech, including high tech. We have examples from space and space tech. We mentioned DPI and fintech, and now, of course, AI. So that's what this book is about. It's about the jugaad mindset applied in a tech context, which enables you to scale not only for India, but potentially for the world.
So would you say that between jugaad innovation and now, this idea has been expanded on? Because jugaad brings with it that connotation of improvisation. But here I think you are talking about frugal by design. From first principles onwards, bringing that into the design thinking that you apply to a startup at the very beginning, perhaps if it's policy that we're talking about, to make that the base. So would you say there's been an evolution in that sense from your earlier thought on this matter?
So if you look at how we've evolved the idea of how the economy, the world is so matured with the idea of jugaad, it was always seen as an improvisational hack. And that's the part that we really want to focus on changing, is the mindset, because we're taking away the negative connotation of jugaad and saying, can we make it an intentional part of strategy, where you're looking at bringing in all the constraints, using those constraints as a launch pad, so to say, with whatever problem you're looking at solving. It's front-loaded, it's intentional, and it's something which is very deliberate in your strategy. It's not something that you improvise on the go. A big part of that is actually ensuring that you're able to execute well, and you're able to focus on what's truly necessary in the process of innovation, so that you're removing the bells and whistles around it and then keeping just the essential and going
So would you then say frugality demands a certain, specificity in thinking?
It does. That's what Jaideep was saying, that it's a mindset that has to grow over a period of time. And I think we have gone past that phase where money can solve problems or money alone can solve problems. And I think there is this need to look at being really creative in the way we can get into
But to
the
be a little
problem-solving process.
contrarian over here, this might also then be used as an argument to underfund, saying that, if you can make do with less, then make do with less in every possible scenario. So are there sectors where this could actually pose a problem? Perhaps the health sector, perhaps infrastructure.
Yeah. So I think it's not just the mindset, but there's also a process. And that process can be described in various ways. It could be thought of as a design thinking approach. So Priyank mentioned that deliberate strategic intentionality that you have at the start are married to this process, which focuses at the outset on the problem that you're trying to solve from the perspective of the people facing that problem. And that is a key bit. And you'd only after you've understood that problem, then come up with your design, your solution. And the point is not about cutting costs or resources for the sake of doing it. It is making the best use of limited resources in the service of solving that problem. And so sometimes I don't like the word frugal because it sounds like it's just cost cutting for the sake of it and which has a negative connotation. And that's why sometimes I like the word jugaad because it also
Right.
sounds, it captures that element of ingenuity where you're thinking differently, but very much pressed in the service of the problem you're trying to solve. So I think that's how we try to address this point, this legitimate point you raised, that it could just lead to cost cutting for the sake of cost cutting.
Right.
And you could
Especially in
have false
sectors that are
economics.
now being underfunded almost deliberately. For instance, the environmental sector. Would you say, how do you sort of then, how do leaders think around that, where funding for sustainability, government funding or funding at the institutional level is probably, a fraction of what it used to be, given the current politics of the day?
Yeah. So I think what needs to happen is redefinition of the business model itself. We can't apply all of the frugal frameworks if we are thinking with the old business models.
Right.
And that is a systemic shift that's required. So the systemic shift is very much needed in terms of to bring in some of these new ideas and new ways of doing things. The second point I want to make here is that whether it's frugal or you want to call it jugaad, it's always a spectrum. So it's not jugaad or no jugaad. There are degrees in which you can apply this, and there are degrees in which you have to go back to the process and look at systems and look at stuff that's worked in the past and not try and reinvent the wheel just because,
Right.
you've got a new
Term.
term and word and, that's the flavor. So it has to be married into what works and what exists.
Right.
And that's an important part
Yeah.
of applying any strategy.
But I think you do actually discuss a lot of very relevant examples in the book. And, you mentioned this already in passing. India's digital public infrastructure has actually been something that the world has taken notice of, whether it's UPI. We've had leaders coming in, European leaders from the US, who are just astounded by the fact that your local panwala or that your vegetable seller on the road actually has a QR code and is accepting digital payments. And they just don't have anything similar in their country. So we've proved that that can happen and that can be scaled up
Yes.
at perhaps not the kind of costs or the kind of expenses one would have imagined. You've talked about the ISRO example as well. So would you say that some of this is already happening and that there's a lot to learn, at the macro level that perhaps individual businesses can also
Yeah,
learn from?
absolutely.
Yeah.
So the book builds on what's happened in the last, say, 10 years,
Right.
Since the Jugaad Innovation book was written. And as I said, we've seen a progressive maturation of the Indian ecosystem, innovation ecosystem. And we have examples of this kind of approach, this frugal Jugaad approach, being done in a very strategic way so that you can scale. And in some cases, we have done it not only for India, but as a first in the world with implications for other countries. So I think that's absolutely right. And I think that also going back to your earlier question about sustainability, there's a lot of that happening as well in India. For instance, with renewables, electric vehicles, battery swapping, that kind of stuff, which we also feature in the book, which again has implications not only for India but the world, and addresses this question that you asked earlier about all this cost cutting and backlash against ESG and so on. Because what the book is arguing is that if you approach those kinds of issues merely as a cost cutting exercise, you're not going to get very far, or a compliance exercise.
Yeah.
But if you approach it as an opportunity to innovate and create value, often with less resources in the long term, then you have something that is much more long term and
Right.
shape shifting.
You know, these examples actually demonstrate that frugality can be applied at scale, and it can be applied in building a nation and providing services to a nation as well. So a lot of organizations say, you know what, if we are gone past, we're not a startup, we are a large organization. Is it relevant to us or not? It's relevant because you can do it at a country scale, you can do it at an organization scale. You gave the example of UPI. You know, we've not celebrated this enough. You don't realize that the poorest of the poor person in the country today has access to digital money. And that means that they're able to be participating in the digital economy. So if you're able
Not to mention an ONDC where anyone can
Of course.
actually digitally sell their wares.
So
Yes.
I'm talking about one application of
Yeah.
the Aadhaar stack, and then there's ONDC, and then there are a whole bunch of other applications that are now being built to actually get inclusion on. What's important to understand from this example, and these are stories which are well talked about in a lot of other literature as well, is the cost at the back end. You know, we've created systems. The government has been successful in creating systems that at the back end also are manageable from a cost perspective, and therefore they are scalable. And because they scale, the cost comes down, and that kind of creates that positive flywheel that's required to actually scale frugal innovation to, in this case, a global scale. And now we are, you know, taking this to many other countries.
Right. Yes.
And what we have created.
Now, I want to sort of go back to that earlier question I was asking. You actually work with a lot of young founders. You founded a Center for Entrepreneurship. How do all of these things play out for young founders? How possible is it for a young founder to apply these principles when they're when they're first setting up a business? And particularly now, everyone's talking about artificial intelligence. Every young founder wants an AI startup.
Yes.
So is it possible, for instance, in the AI space? Because at least when you look around globally, whether it's China, where so much of state sponsorship goes in, or deep research goes in that's sponsored by the state, or whether you look at the US, where companies just have staggering burn rates. How do you frugally innovate for AI?
Yeah. So I'll give a little bit of context from the Center for Entrepreneurship, and then Jaideep, maybe you can talk about what's happening in the world of AI. So for us, every startup has to have a story where they can use AI to scale, use AI or deep tech applications where they can bring about a sense of frugality in whatever they want to scale. And that's something which again is as a deliberate part of saying, are you using technology the right way? Are you using it to really create the impact that needs to be done? And is that part of your business strategy from day one? Just using AI, and that's it's become the flavor of the season, is not enough. But is it going to lower your costs and your structure? That's going to be the scale-up model that you're going to bring about. So we've seen that kind of conversation and that very deliberate way of looking at strategy works very well for our students.
Where do founders fail, though?
I think the failure happens in not understanding the technology enough and not being able to see how the scale-up of that is going to impact the business model and how fast you can do that. A lot of competitors are able to get to what they're trying to do much faster. So the pace of change with AI is also sort of impacting the way they're able to get to that success model. China has done some success in the way they've created AI, and maybe Jaideep, you want to talk about DeepSeek and some of those models.
I think the AI debate is a very relevant debate.
Yeah.
And I think this whole lean spark approach comes alive in that context. So as you pointed out, we have the Silicon Valley model where they're literally throwing trillions of dollars at building ever larger language models, where they use very large data sets of typically English language text. They have very high-end chips that are needed for developing those foundational models. They have massive data centers that are very energy hungry and then also need water to cool them. So the whole stack is built on resources. And then, of course, all that translates to investment. And the Silicon Valley model is built around that kind of approach, whether it's for AI or for anything else, the venture capital approach. They have the capital, they have the talent, they can do it. China too has that kind of capital, although it's often come from the state. But they also have a lot of startups and companies that have done innovative things in this space, including DeepSeek. They have the talent in it, and so on. And there is a race going on between those two, which is very, in many ways, resource heavy. Now, for everybody else,
Though, of course, the DeepSeek model is a little under question at the
yeah,
moment.
and also that was also a bit of
Yeah.
jugaad, by the way, because
Right.
they didn't have the high-end chips, so they had to focus on software. So China is sort of in between in some way, but nevertheless, they do have, and it's a race now. But what about, say, India, for instance?
Yeah.
I think there's a very strong case that we make in the book that we cannot follow and should not follow that very resource-expensive approach. So we don't have that kind of capital. Even if we did, we have other things to spend that money on. Even if we could spend that money on AI, if something is so expensive to develop, how would we make it affordable for people? And again, in India, the revolutionary potential of AI is in the following, that we could offer potentially every school kid around the country, including remote areas, that personal tutor on their phone in voice in their language. Or every Indian, even in remote areas, access to their own doctor on their phone in their language in voice. But in order to do that, it's a bit like the Aadhaar story, it's a bit like UPI. To be able to scale to the whole population, it'll have to be highly affordable.
Right.
And to be highly affordable, it has to be frugal in how you develop these solutions. So what's happening now in India is a whole movement. And we feature, for instance, Sarvam.ai, led by Vivek Raghavan, who's happened to be one of my classmates in IIT and who I know very well, where the focus is very much on AI for all rather than AI for a few. And it's
Right.
very much on frugal AI. So what do they do? How are they frugalizing AI? Smaller language models dedicated to specific niche applications like primary education or primary health,
Or agriculture.
agriculture, and doing that on edge devices like phones, in voice, in specific local languages where you, in any case, don't have the big data sets.
Right.
And so India is increasingly, where AI is concerned, the use case capital of the world. What we do have are lots of problems that need solving and a lot of people who face those problems. And so this is a huge opportunity for our young people. And we have lots of young people now entering the workforce who are also technically savvy, but also understand these principles of really looking at problems and so on. Huge opportunity for them to set up startups that could be transformational, not just in India, but in the world.
But having said that, again, we are then solving for problems that are particular to India or to the global south. But where does that leave us in the overall race for AI? Do you have to then, spend like the West in order to be at the same scale or at the same level?
I think these problems are not specific to India. I think these problems are pretty ubiquitous in different parts of the world in different pockets.
Right.
We are consciously working on them because the scale at which we need to deal with them is much larger than any other part of the world. And, just like we looked at certain parts of the world for technology, for ideas, for innovation, the world is looking at us. If we can solve it at scale in India, then it's a copy paste into different parts of the world. So I think.
And would you say that founders also have to look at different solutions for solving for India and solving for Bharat, as it were, and be aware of those distinctions and not talk down or not think down?
I think if you can solve for Bharat, you've solved
for India also.
And that's what Jaideep was talking about, right? We have to solve for the people in their language, accessible to them, and the technology that works for them, that they can operate without it having the bells and whistles. but yet being complete in what needs to be
I'd
done.
love to give two examples that I
Yes, please.
discovered very recently after we published the book. And that's one of the downsides of writing a book. The day after it's published,
There's
you
always
discover
more.
many.
Well,
So,
that's for the second print, the
yes,
reprint, right?
yes. So one of them is something that Amul has developed called Saral Ben. And this
Called, pardon me?
Saral Ben,
Okay.
so Gujarati word for a lady.
Lady, Ben,
Saral.
Saral Ben.
And so this is an AI agent to help their members. And of course, we know that Amul has got a very large number of members providing milk, which is then, pasteurized and so on. And the problem they often have is access to good veterinary services and advice. And now they can get Saralben is an AI agent who'll speak to them in their language and voice on their phone and address questions that they face while they're facing them. And what they've done very cleverly is they have used their decades of data on the kinds of questions that their members have. So they're building on what they have. It's very specific to that. But now, if you can do that for Amul, for their cattle farmers,
Right.
you could do it for similar cooperatives across India and elsewhere. Another fascinating example is Niram AI. It's a Bangalore-based company which does breast cancer screening in a non-invasive way. Essentially, you just have thermal imaging. So you have a camera. So a person can be fully clothed. They don't have to be touched or anything. The thermal camera takes these images, high-resolution images, and finds the temperature profile.
Wow.
And it's trained on previous data with temperature profiles, and they can detect very quickly using AI some irregularities, and then you can do further.
That's
testing.
amazing. I mean,
So
it sort of
this-
then negates the whole going for annual checkups and mammograms and all the rest of it.
Exactly. And you can do this at scale, not just in India, but you can do this anywhere in the world. So, and of course, there's no, radioactivity involved. So you're relatively safe from. You're not taking X-ray. So, these are the kinds of opportunities in India. If you can do it for Bharat, you can do it for India. If you do it for India, you can do it for the world.
Wonderful. Since we have some students here who are, listening to this now and who will be looking at this later on as well, I want to now sort of direct a few questions that I think, the students would really be interested in knowing. First of all, we have an MBA program, but there's always sometimes this gap between what is taught as part of an MBA curriculum, but again, the experience of founders as they are starting out, or young people in businesses, is very different from what you learn as part of a formalized curriculum. Do you see those gaps when you work with young founders? And if there was anything that you would say to our faculty here first, in terms of how they could perhaps change, not perhaps the way they teach, but perhaps what they teach, what would that be?
Yeah. So I think the curriculum is grounded in frameworks. Curriculum is grounded in understanding how you can apply those models in different situations. The adaptation of those models has changed and is evolving every day in a sort of AI-driven world, in a very high-tech driven world. And the students need to learn that adaptation really well to be relevant. So for anybody to say that there is a gap between what's in the classroom and what's going to be in the real world, yes, there will always be that gap. I think that contextualization and how quickly you can sort of adapt to that context is what's going to make this model work. For Jaideep, any stories from your part of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've been teaching in the Cambridge Judge Business School now for many years. And for many years, we've had this feedback from our employers of our students, who say that they expect our students to know what's in the textbooks, what's in the standard curriculum. And so we can't stop doing that. We have to have the old classic lecture style. Students then understand something, learn something, and are able to demonstrate that they know. But equally, they expect that on day one, when our students enter their company, they are able to be entrepreneurial. They are able to be creative problem solvers. They are able to demonstrate resilience, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
And then the question for us as academics, how do you teach that?
Exactly.
These are things that are learned by doing. So What we then do, speaking about the curriculum and the structure of the program, is that we give our students lots of opportunities to learn by doing.
Right.
In groups, very diverse groups, which is again what you would face in a startup. So that helps you to also think about how you.
So what would a lean spark style of doing, say in the first 6 months of building something new, be like?
Great question. So again, you would have a small team, diverse team, could be about 4 or 5 people, who have a passion, shared passion for solving a problem. That's the key starting point. It's a problem that they are passionate about, but the world also cares about. So that's the first step. And that they really then understand and spend time understanding what that problem is they're trying to solve from the perspective of people facing a problem. You had asked earlier, why do a lot of startups fail? It's because they often lead with a solution, not with trying to understand the problem. They lead with the technology, not trying to understand the problem. So that's the first step in this approach. That team is doing that. Only then are they then coming up with a solution. And again, it's not a solution that is predetermined in their mind. They might then choose the right resources, you mentioned earlier, that make the best use of what's available in that context, etc., what's affordable. And, one of the key principles in our book is purposeful simplicity. So guided by the problem and the need, you then choose the right features in your solution. You don't over-engineer the solution. So that, to a certain extent, and then you test. In another principle is lean execution. You test in very tight loops versions or primitive versions of the solution of minimum viable product with the customer or the user, and you iterate quickly. And then when you get to the sweet spot, you then scale to other customers.
Do you think Indian startups have got too caught up in the whole funding game, as it were, Series A funding, Series B funding? You have all this money coming in. So what could have started out being a fairly lean operation sort of suddenly starts drowning in too much funding? And then do you kind of lose this simplicity of thinking somewhere along the way?
Partly, I think funding is, but let me also clarify that funding is important. At a certain stage, you do need the funding.
But we're also looking at a funding winter of sorts for the last couple of years,
and
at
that's
least.
Where
that requires a reset. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I think you're right. And that's where the mindset of thinking frugally and finding solutions with whatever access to funds that they have will actually be more and more relevant. So this model of thinking will be applicable in different phases and different stages of every startup, and also different external circumstances. A lot of startups have been impacted by what's happening in the world today, and they've had to rethink the business model because supply chain models have completely broken down. A lot of markets that they were looking at accessing are no longer accessible to them. And so, again, think lean and think of what you can do with the limited resources that you have, the constraints that you have, and the sort of the outcome that you can
Let's
derive.
make this a little more accessible to some of our students here, because our students all want to sort of be startup founders, preferably in the AI world. There is an AI gold rush almost, as it were. Do you have any words of sort of wisdom or caution for them?
So, I just also to address your previous question. I think we have to be very careful about the venture capital approach to innovation, which is, again, a very Silicon Valley approach. I don't think that approach is appropriate for India for the following reason. It's a very resource-intensive approach. What do? They have lots of capital, which they throw at startups, and fully knowing that 9 out of 10 of those are going to fail. But one, with the money that they put in, will scale and possibly become a global monopolist, which will then be able to extract rents way into the future. That's their model. I don't think, as I said, that's appropriate for India. We don't have that kind of capital, and it also actually makes you lazy in your thinking. And you're actually, what are you doing? You're actually bribing your customers to buy a solution. Instead, if you use the Lean Spark approach, which is focused on the problem, your customers will pay you for your solution. That's the more appropriate way to build a business. And you will also build it without that kind of capital. So I think that's key. And that's why this book is so relevant, I think, for the Indian founder and startup.
Indeed. So with your permission, I'm going to sort of do a quick rapid fire round of, what your responses will be. And so these have to be literally sort of one line or one word answers, if you can indulge us to that extent. one Indian company that's getting frugal innovation right today?
Sarvam.ai.
Okay. Would your answer be the same?
No, I think Sarvam is a
Yeah.
great example of, and of course there are many other
Right.
examples we've talked
In the
about in the
book.
book. Yeah,
Okay. One sector where you think India can lead globally?
I think digital public infrastructure. It's a great.
And we're already
model,
doing
yes.
it. That model is carrying to other countries already. One hype that everyone is talking about that you don't believe in?
So the venture capital model,
Yeah.
that you can just pump your business full of money and scale that way and achieve global success.
Would you have a
Yeah,
different response?
no, I think
Yeah?
money is that model has to be questioned at some point in time.
And I think you've already covered this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. AI, opportunity or bubble?
I think it's a huge opportunity if you can leverage what the foundations of AI offer you. It's a huge opportunity.
I'd say frugal AI is the opportunity. So expensive AI is the bubble.
Bubble. Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much indeed for joining us and for talking about your book. We're all really looking forward to reading it in greater detail and exploring some of these ideas. I know they're going to be very useful and helpful for our students. So thank you indeed for joining us in this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.